From runaway wife to criminal co-conspirator, Clara Scoth finally surrendered to the undeniable heat between her and her billionaire CEO boss, Marcus Croft. But just as they let their guards down, their empire comes crashing down around them. A vindictive rival has triggered a federal audit, exposing the dark, illegal origins of Marcus's $70 million fortune. With the SEC seizing their hard drives and prison time looming, the brilliant litigator must cross the line she swore she never would. Clara decides to weaponize the very Vegas marriage she spent 6 years trying to erase, transforming a criminal payoff into a marital asset. But as they forge documents and lie to the feds, the danger and the romance reaches an explosive boiling point. Episode 21. The words hung in the dark, quiet expanse of the Tribeca penthouse, fragile but absolute. Touch me. For a fraction of a second, Marcus didn't move. He stood frozen, staring down at Clara's hands anchored around his wrists. The billionaire CEO, the man who calculated global market shifts in his sleep, looked completely and utterly unmoored. Then the dam broke. Marcus let out a ragged, desperate exhale that sounded almost like a prayer. He twisted his wrists out of her grasp, but only so he could frame her face with both hands. He didn't kiss her immediately. He just rested his forehead against hers, his thumbs tracing the high cut of her cheekbones, his breathing heavy and erratic. 6 years, Marcus whispered, the words scraping against his throat. I have imagined this moment every single day for 6 years. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, the sound deafening in her own ears. The last piece of her professional armor, the untouchable, ruthless litigator she had spent thousands of hours building, dissolved entirely under the heat of his hands. She didn't want the armor anymore. She wanted him. Clara tilted her chin up, closing the final, agonizing inch between them. The moment their lips met, the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't the punishing, territorial kiss from the boardroom hallway. It was a complete, consuming collision. Marcus's mouth was hot, tasting of amber scotch and pure, unadulterated devotion. He kissed her like a man who had been starving, his hands sliding from her face to tangle deep into the pinned-up twist of her hair, scattering hairpins onto the dark hardwood floor. Clara gasped against his mouth as her hair cascaded down her shoulders. She reached up, her hands gripping his broad shoulders, pulling him closer until there wasn't a millimeter of space between them. Marcus groaned, a deep, primal sound that vibrated straight through Clara's chest. He wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, lifting her off her feet with effortless power. Clara's arms instinctively wrapped around his neck as he carried her out of the living room, completely bypassing the plush leather couch he had promised to sleep on. The hallway was pitch black, but Marcus moved with absolute, terrifying certainty. He didn't break the kiss. He backed her through the heavy oak doors of the master suite, his boot kicking the door shut behind them with a loud, echoing thud that sealed them inside. He didn't take her to the center of the massive California king bed. He backed her up until her spine hit the cool, smooth glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. The contrast of the cold glass against her back and the blistering heat of his body pressing into her made Clara's breath hitch. Marcus pulled back just enough to look at her. The neon glow of the city bathed them both in shadow, but Clara could see the dark, dilated possessiveness in his eyes. He reached down, his fingers catching the collar of her silk ivory blouse. Tell me to stop, Marcus murmured, his chest heaving as he stared down at her lips. Tell me you want your boundary back, Clara. Tell me now, because if you don't. I don't, Clara interrupted, her voice shaking with a fierce, reckless certainty. She grabbed the lapels of his open collar. I don't want boundaries tonight. I want my husband. Marcus's eyes darkened to absolute pitch. He didn't ask again. His hands moved with ruthless efficiency, making quick work of the buttons on her blouse. The expensive silk pulled at her feet, followed a moment later by his shirt. The cool air of the penthouse hit Clara's bare skin, but it was instantly replaced by the searing heat of Marcus's hands as he lifted her again, finally carrying her toward the bed. When her back hit the plush mattress, Marcus followed her down, his heavy, muscular frame blanketing hers in the dark. For 3 years, they had fought across boardrooms. They had weaponized contracts, traded legal threats, and built walls of ice around their hearts. But here, in the dark, stripped of their corporate titles and their expensive suits, there was no litigation left. There was only the terrifying, inevitable reality that they belonged to each other. Marcus kissed his way down her jaw, his lips pressing against the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. "You're mine," Marcus whispered against her skin, the words a dark, permanent vow in the quiet room. "You have always been mine." Clara closed her eyes, her hands dragging down his back, pulling him flush against her. The fear was gone. The running was over. "Then prove it," she breathed. And as the city of New York slept beneath them, the ruthless billionaire CEO finally showed the runaway wife exactly what it meant to come home. And that's the end of episode 21. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments below. Your feedback helps us know you're watching and encourages us to keep bringing you more content. See you in the next episode. Episode 22. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Tribeca penthouse, casting sharp, geometric shadows across the wreckage of the master suite. Clara awoke to the heavy, anchoring weight of Marcus's arm thrown across her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. For the first time in 6 years, there was no panic. There was no desperate urge to gather her clothes and slip out before the sun fully rose. She opened her eyes, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of morning light. "You're thinking about the liquidation drafts." Marcus's voice was a low, sleep-rough rumble against her bare shoulder. He hadn't been asleep. He had been lying there in the quiet, watching her breathe, radiating a terrifying, possessive contentment. Clara smiled against the pillow, turning over within the cage of his arms. She looked up into his dark eyes, the memory of last night's absolute surrender still burning heavily in the air between them. "I am a senior partner," Clara murmured, her hand coming up to trace the silver scar on his wrist. "I am always thinking about the liquidation drafts." Marcus's hand slid up her spine, his fingers tangling in the messy cascade of her hair. The arrogant, devastatingly confident smirk that had driven her insane in the boardroom yesterday was gone, replaced by something much deeper. "You didn't run," Marcus whispered, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "You didn't give me anywhere to run to," Clara replied softly. But the accusation had lost its teeth. It wasn't a cage anymore. It was a fortress, and he had built it specifically for her. Marcus leaned down, his mouth covering hers in a slow, intoxicating kiss that tasted of morning and absolute permanence. Clara melted into the mattress, her fingers curling into his shoulders, entirely ready to let the corporate world burn down for just one more hour in the dark. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic buzzing shattered the quiet. Clara's cell phone was vibrating violently against the mahogany nightstand. Marcus groaned, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "Ignore it. I am the CEO. I declare a firm-wide holiday." "It's a Tuesday, Marcus," Clara breathed, though she didn't make a move to reach for the phone. The buzzing stopped. 3 seconds later, it started again. And then the penthouse landline on the other side of the bed began to ring. The spell broke. The professional instincts, honed over thousands of hours of high-stakes litigation, instantly flooded Clara's system. She sat up, pulling the silk sheet over her chest, and reached for her cell phone. The caller ID flashed in bright red. "Emma, paralegal, emergency." Clara swiped the screen. "Scoth." She caught herself, looking down at the silver ring on her hand. "Croft." "Speak." "Mrs. Croft." Emma's voice was high-pitched and breathless, carrying the distinct echo of the Sterling and Vance bullpen. "I am so sorry to call this early, but Arthur Sterling is demanding both you and Mr. Croft in the executive boardroom immediately. It's the boutique firm acquisitions." Marcus sat up beside Clara, the lazy heat in his eyes instantly evaporating. The lethal corporate predator was back online in a fraction of a second. "What happened to the acquisitions, Emma?" Clara asked, her voice dropping into its cold, courtroom register. "Did the non-disclosures leak?" "Worse," Emma stammered. "The 3 boutique firms, they rejected the buyout offers at 6 a.m. this morning. All of them. Simultaneously." Clara's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. They were hemorrhaging cash. Our buyout was double their market valuation. Who would fund a rejection?" "That's the thing, Mrs. Croft," Emma said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "They aren't hemorrhaging cash anymore. Last night, at exactly 3 a.m., all 3 firms received a massive, anonymous injection of private equity. A poison pill. They have enough capital to fight our hostile takeover in open court for years." Clara stopped breathing. Her legal mind rapidly calculated the market moves, tracing the invisible lines of capital back to the only entity angry enough, rich enough, and vindictive enough to drop that much cash just to spite them. "It wasn't anonymous," Clara said softly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Marcus swung his legs over the side of the bed, his back rigid. "Chloe Dean." "Yes, Mr. Croft," Emma confirmed over the speaker. "Ms. Dean's legal team filed an antitrust injunction against Sterling and Vance an hour ago. She's claiming our hostile takeovers constitute an illegal monopoly. She's funding the defense of our rivals." Clara lowered the phone. Chloe Dean hadn't just walked away from the merger. She had declared a full-scale, scorched-earth war on Sterling and Vance. And she had targeted the exact 3 firms Clara was trying to acquire, effectively paralyzing Clara's first major move as senior partner. "Tell Arthur Sterling we will be in the boardroom in 45 minutes, Marcus commanded. He reached over and ended the call. The silence rushed back into the master suite, but it was no longer heavy with intimacy. It was charged with the electric, volatile anticipation of a corporate bloodbath. Clara looked at Marcus. The vulnerability of the night before had completely vanished beneath his skin. His jaw was clenched, his dark eyes fixed on the Manhattan skyline, calculating casualties. "She wants to destroy the firm," Clara said, throwing the covers back. The adrenaline was already humming in her veins. "She wants to prove to the board that keeping me was a $2 billion mistake." Marcus stood up. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man who had just been handed the perfect excuse to finally take the gloves off. He walked around the bed, stopping right in front of Clara. He reached out, his hands gripping her bare shoulders, pulling her up until she was standing inches away from him. "She doesn't know who she just picked a fight with," Marcus said, his voice a low, dark timbre that sent a shiver straight down Clara's spine. "Get dressed, wife. We have an heiress to bury." And that's the end of episode 22. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments below. Your feedback helps us know you're watching and encourages us to keep bringing you more content. See you in the next episode. Episode 23. The ride to the Sterling and Vance building was a terrifying display of synchronized power. There was no suffocating silence in the back of the Maybach today. The glass partition separating them from the driver was rolled up, and the cabin was filled with the rapid-fire exchange of legal precedent and financial loopholes. Clara had her laptop balanced on her knees, her fingers flying across the keyboard, while Marcus was on a secure line with their offshore accounting division, tracking the exact origin of Chloe Dean's sudden capital injection. Through the chaos of the impending corporate war, one thing remained entirely, intimately still. Marcus's left hand rested on Clara's thigh. His thumb slowly, rhythmically stroked the fabric of her tailored charcoal skirt, an anchoring, possessive touch that completely short-circuited the anxiety threatening to claw up Clara's throat. Yesterday, his touch had been a psychological weapon. Today, it was a shield. The capital didn't come from Dean Enterprises' primary liquid accounts, Marcus said, hanging up the secure phone. His jaw was tight, his dark eyes fixed on the data scrolling across Clara's screen. Chloe bypassed her own board. She routed $40 million through 3 blind shell corporations in the Caymans to fund the boutique firms. Clara's fingers paused on the keyboard. A slow, dangerous thrill ignited in her chest. She bypassed her board? Clara asked, her legal mind instantly locking onto the fatal error. To fund an anonymous poison pill defense against a publicly traded entity? Yes, Marcus murmured, a lethal smirk touching his lips as he saw the exact moment the litigator in her caught the scent of blood. Which means it's not just petty revenge, Clara finished, her eyes flashing. It's a direct violation of SEC disclosure regulations. It's corporate espionage. Marcus leaned in, pressing a hard, brief kiss to her temple. Destroy her, Clara. The atmosphere inside the Sterling and Vance executive boardroom was borderline apocalyptic. Arthur Sterling was pacing the length of the mahogany table, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. The 12 senior partners were shouting over one another, clutching printed copies of the antitrust injunction Chloe Dean's lawyers had filed at dawn. When Marcus and Clara pushed through the heavy double doors, the shouting abruptly died. Do you have any idea what you have done? Arthur bellowed, slamming a hand onto the table, aiming his fury squarely at Marcus. An antitrust injunction. The SEC has frozen our commercial acquisition funds. Dean Enterprise is claiming we are building an illegal monopoly, and because you publicly humiliated Chloe Dean, the federal judges are actually entertaining the motion. Sit down, Arthur, Marcus commanded. The sheer, glacial authority in his voice forced the older man to freeze mid-stride. Marcus walked to his chair at the head of the table, but he didn't sit. He stood tall, a towering monument of untouchable power, and gestured to the space beside him. The CEO yields the floor to his lead counsel. Clara unlatched her briefcase. She didn't look at the panicked faces of the partners. She pulled out a fresh stack of legal briefs she had printed in the car and slid them down the center of the table. Chloe Dean made a fatal miscalculation, Clara announced, her voice a cold, ringing bell in the terrified silence of the room. She assumed that by filing an antitrust injunction, she would force us onto the defensive. She assumed we would scramble to prove our acquisitions were legal. Aren't they? One of the partners asked weakly. They are perfectly legal, Clara snapped. But we are not going to waste our time proving it. We are going on the offensive. Arthur squinted at the document in front of him. What is this, Miss Scoth? That, Mr. Sterling, is a countersuit, Clara stated, planting her hands flat on the table, leaning forward with the terrifying, predatory grace she had learned directly from the man standing beside her. We are suing Chloe Dean personally, not Dean Enterprise, but Chloe Dean as an individual, for tortious interference, market manipulation, and corporate espionage. The boardroom erupted into frantic murmurs. You can't prove that, Arthur protested. She funded those boutique firms anonymously. Her lawyers will tie us up in discovery for 5 years. She funded them through Cayman shell corporations, Clara corrected sharply, which she failed to disclose to the SEC or her own board of directors. I have drafted an emergency subpoena for Ms. Dean's personal financial records, citing reasonable suspicion of federal wire fraud. Clara paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the threat settle over the room. If the federal courts granted the subpoena, Chloe Dean's entire empire would be subjected to a devastating public audit. It would ruin her. But to file a countersuit of this magnitude, Arthur said, his voice trembling as he looked from Clara to Marcus, to accuse a billionaire heiress of federal wire fraud. If we are wrong, Marcus, the defamation countersuit will bankrupt this firm. You will lose everything. The room went dead silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to the CEO. Clara looked at him too. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was asking him to gamble his $70 million empire, his entire legacy, on her legal instincts. Marcus didn't look at the board. He looked solely at Clara. The dark, burning devotion in his eyes was absolute. He didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his platinum fountain pen, and leaned over the table. He signed his name on the bottom line of the countersuit with violent, sweeping strokes. "File it," Marcus ordered, tossing the pen onto the mahogany table. Before Arthur could utter another word of protest, the heavy, multi-line conference phone in the center of the table began to ring. The red light flashed, indicating an external priority call directly to the boardroom line. Emma, the paralegal, who had been hovering near the door, went pale. She scrambled to check the caller ID on her tablet. "Mr. Croft," Emma squeaked, her voice shaking. It's Chloe Dean's legal team. They have Ms. Dean on the line. She is requesting to speak with you to negotiate a surrender of our assets." Marcus looked at the flashing red light. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. He didn't reach for the phone. He took a half step back, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked at Clara. "Answer it, Mrs. Croft," Marcus murmured, his voice laced with dark, intoxicating pride. "Tell the heiress what she just bought." Clara reached out and pressed the speaker button. "Marcus," Chloe Dean's voice purred through the boardroom speakers, dripping with venomous triumph. "I hope you are having a productive morning. I believe we have some terms to discuss regarding your impending bankruptcy." Clara leaned down, her lips inches from the microphone. "Ms. Dean," Clara said, her voice dropping into a lethal, frictionless register that made the senior partners physically recoil. "My husband is currently unavailable, but as his lead counsel, I am calling to inform you that we will not be discussing terms. We will be discussing the federal subpoena for your offshore accounts that was filed 3 minutes ago. See you in court." Clara hit the button, disconnecting the line and plunging the boardroom into stunned, absolute silence. And that's the end of episode 23. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments below. Your feedback helps us know you're watching and encourages us to keep bringing you more content. See you in the next episode. Episode 24. The dial tone echoed through the executive boardroom of Sterling and Vance, a harsh, mechanical sound that felt louder than a bomb blast. Clara stood at the head of the mahogany table, her finger still resting on the disconnect button of the conference phone. The 12 senior partners were entirely paralyzed. Arthur Sterling looked as though he might be entering cardiac arrest. No one hung up on Chloe Dean. No one threatened the heiress to a $2 billion empire with federal wire fraud and then simply ended the call. Except Clara Scoth. Slowly, Marcus uncrossed his arms. The sound of his slow, deliberate applause cut through the suffocating silence. He clapped exactly 3 times, the hollow smack of his hands echoing off the glass walls. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice a rich, dark velvet completely devoid of fear. "That is why she is the lead counsel." Arthur finally found his voice, though it was an octave higher than usual. "She is going to retaliate, Marcus. Chloe will call the SEC. She will leverage her father's political connections to bury the subpoena." "Let her call them," Clara interjected smoothly, picking up her briefcase. The adrenaline was a lethal, hyper-focused hum in her veins. The Cayman's routing data is immutable. The moment she attempts to leverage a political favor to suppress a federal subpoena, she upgrades her charge from wire fraud to obstruction of justice. Clara looked around the table, meeting the terrified eyes of the partners one by one. "We have 48 hours before the federal judge reviews the filing. I want the entire commercial litigation team divided into 3 strike forces. We are running mock trials, financial audits, and witness deposition prep around the clock. No one goes home until the heiress is in handcuffs." She didn't wait for their approval. She turned and walked toward the double doors. Marcus followed her, his stride perfectly matching hers. As they pushed out of the boardroom and into the 42nd floor bullpen, the atmosphere had visibly shifted. The junior associates and paralegals parted like the Red Sea. They weren't just staring at the billionaire CEO and the lawyer he had forced into a marriage anymore. They were watching an apex predator and the woman who had just handed him the kill. The whispers had stopped. The respect was absolute, laced with a healthy dose of pure terror. Marcus didn't walk to his own suite. He followed Clara directly into her transparent glass office and closed the door. The heavy click of the lock dropping into place severed them from the chaotic hum of the firm. Clara dropped her briefcase onto the desk and let out a long, shuddering breath. Her hands immediately began to shake, the post-battle crash hitting her nervous system like a freight train. She braced her hands on the edge of her desk, bowing her head. "Hey," Marcus murmured softly. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't trap her against the desk this time. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against the solid, anchoring heat of his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips pressing firmly against her racing pulse. "You just declared war on a billionaire heiress and hung up on her," Marcus whispered against her skin, a dark, vibrating laugh rumbling in his chest. "You're going to be the death of me, Clara." Clara leaned back into his embrace, closing her eyes as his hands smoothed flat over her stomach. "She interrupted my morning." "She did," Marcus agreed, his teeth lightly grazing her collarbone, sending a sharp, electric jolt straight down her spine. "And we are going to make her pay for that. But right now, you need to breathe." "If the federal judge denies the subpoena," Clara whispered, the fear finally bleeding into her voice, "the defamation suit will bankrupt the firm, Marcus." "I just bet your entire empire on a paper trail." Marcus turned her around in his arms. His dark eyes were entirely completely serious, stripped of the arrogant CEO and the boardroom predator. "I didn't buy this empire for the board, Clara." "I bought it for you," Marcus said, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "If it burns to the ground tomorrow, I don't care, as long as you're standing in the ashes with me." He leaned down, kissing her with a fierce, possessive tenderness that completely shattered the remaining tension in her chest. For the first time in her entire life, Clara wasn't carrying the weight of survival alone. He was holding it with her. 3 sharp, frantic knocks hit the glass door. Clara jumped, breaking the kiss. Marcus let out a frustrated growl, resting his forehead against hers for a fraction of a second before turning toward the door. It was Arthur Sterling. And he wasn't alone. Standing behind the older partner were 2 men in dark, unremarkable off-the-rack suits, holding leather briefcases. They didn't look like corporate lawyers. They looked like government agents. Marcus unlocked the door, his jaw tightening into a rigid line. "Arthur, I thought I told the board to prepare for litigation." Arthur stepped into the office, his face entirely drained of color. He looked at Clara, then at Marcus. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "These men are from the Securities and Exchange Commission." Clara's brow furrowed. "The SEC? We just filed the injunction against Dean Enterprise 30 minutes ago. They don't move that fast." "They aren't here for Dean Enterprise," Mrs. Croft, the taller of the 2 agents said, stepping forward. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded federal warrant, holding it out to Marcus. "Mr. Croft," the agent continued, his voice devoid of any emotion, "we are here executing a federal audit on your personal liquid assets. Specifically, the origin of the $70 million you used to purchase Sterling and Vance." Clara's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Clara demanded, stepping slightly in front of Marcus, her litigator instincts instantly flaring. "Mr. Croft's capital is fully documented. What possible grounds do you have for an audit?" The agent looked at Clara, his expression grim. "We received an anonymous tip at 8 a.m. this morning, accompanied by a sealed financial dossier. The dossier alleges that Mr. Croft's initial seed capital, secured exactly 6 years ago in Las Vegas, was obtained through illicit offshore wire transfers." The floor dropped out from beneath Clara. 6 years ago. Las Vegas. Chloe Dean hadn't just funded a poison pill. She had hired private investigators to dig into the exact timeline of Clara and Marcus's marriage. And in doing so, she had unearthed a ghost from Marcus's past that he had spent his entire life trying to bury. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look at the warrant. He looked dead into the federal agent's eyes, the lethal, untouchable billionaire freezing over into something much darker and far more dangerous. "You have 24 hours to conduct your audit," Marcus said, his voice dropping to absolute zero. "And when you find nothing, I expect you to walk out of my building." "We will see, Mr. Croft," the agent replied, signaling to his partner. "We need all your hard drives. Now." And that's the end of episode 24. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments below. Your feedback helps us know you're watching and encourages us to keep bringing you more content. See you in the next episode. Episode 25. The silence in Clara's glass office was no longer heavy with intimacy. It was a vacuum, sucked completely dry of oxygen by the stark white federal warrant resting in the SEC agent's hand. Arthur Sterling was clutching the edge of the desk, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Marcus, federal wire fraud? The SEC in our building? The board will demand your immediate resignation before the market closes." "The board will do exactly as they are told," Marcus replied, his voice a glacial, unyielding force. He didn't even look at Arthur. His dark eyes remained locked on the federal agents. "And I am not giving you my hard drives. You can leave, or I can have security escort you out. If you refuse to comply with the federal warrant, Mr. Croft, we will arrest you for obstruction right here in this office," the taller agent warned, his hand moving subtly toward the radio on his belt. Marcus let out a dark, humorless laugh. He took a step forward, completely unfazed by the threat of handcuffs. Before he could close the distance, Clara moved. She stepped directly between her husband and the federal agents, her hand shooting out to snatch the warrant from the agent's grasp. "Mrs. Croft, interfering with a federal." "I am not interfering, agent, I am reading," Clara snapped, her litigator instincts hijacking her nervous system. Her eyes flew across the legal text, scanning the dense paragraphs of federal statutes and seizure parameters with terrifying speed. She found the loophole in exactly 12 seconds. Clara lowered the paper, her eyes flashing with pure, cold courtroom malice. "This warrant is overly broad and procedurally defective," Clara stated, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are requesting the physical seizure of the CEO's primary hard drives based on an anonymous tip. However, the scope of the warrant only explicitly covers transaction ledgers and digital correspondence from the fiscal year of 2020. The agents frowned, exchanging a brief, uncertain glance. "The warrant is signed by a federal judge, ma'am," the agent countered tightly. "And I can have a federal appellate judge issue an emergency stay in exactly 15 minutes citing a Fourth Amendment violation regarding unlawful search and seizure of unrelated corporate data," Clara fired back, taking a step closer to the agent, entirely invading his space. "If you take those physical drives, you compromise the real-time financial security of a $70 million firm. I will personally sue you and your field office for every cent of lost revenue." The agent's jaw tightened. "What are you proposing, counselor?" "I am proposing you take a seat in the lobby," Clara commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the glass door. "Our internal IT forensics team will create a sealed, encrypted clone of the 2020 ledgers. You will get your data, but you are not touching his physical servers. And you are certainly not arresting my husband." The sheer, unapologetic ferocity in her voice left the room paralyzed. Even Marcus, standing directly behind her, let out a slow, heavy breath. The tension rolling off him morphed from lethal aggression into a dark, profound awe. The SEC agents realized they had just walked into a legal buzzsaw. The taller agent nodded stiffly. "We will accept a clone drive. You have 2 hours, Mrs. Croft. We will be waiting in the lobby." "See that you do," Clara said, stepping back. "Arthur, escort them out. And tell the board that if anyone speaks to the press, I will personally draft their termination papers." Arthur didn't argue. He looked thoroughly terrified of Clara as he practically sprinted out the door, the 2 agents following closely behind him. Clara slammed the glass door shut and threw the deadbolt. The metallic click echoed in the quiet office. The adrenaline crashed instantly. Clara dropped the federal warrant onto her desk. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the mahogany just to stay upright. She closed her eyes, her chest heaving. Marcus closed the space between them in a heartbeat. He didn't speak. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest, burying his face in her hair. His heart was hammering against her spine, betraying the absolute terror he had masked from the feds. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus whispered, his voice a hoarse, jagged rasp. "You could have stepped aside. You could have let them take me. It would have saved your career." Clara turned around in his arms. She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising heat. "I am your lead counsel," Clara breathed, her hands coming up to grip his lapels. "And I am your wife. I don't step aside." Marcus closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. He looked entirely undone by her loyalty. "But you are going to tell me the truth," Clara continued, her voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "Right now, Marcus. 6 years ago. Vegas. The $70 million. I need to know exactly what the SEC is going to find on those clone drives." Marcus opened his eyes. The darkness in them was absolute. He took a slow step back, breaking the physical contact, as if he suddenly felt he didn't deserve to touch her. He walked over to the small wet bar in the corner of her office and poured 2 fingers of scotch. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the amber liquid. "They won't find wire fraud," Marcus stated, his voice completely hollow. "Because I didn't steal that money, Clara. It was a buyout." Clara frowned, her legal mind racing. "A buyout from who?" "From Julian Vance," Marcus replied softly. Clara froze. Sterling and Vance. Arthur Sterling was the surviving founder, but Julian Vance had died in a private plane crash 5 years ago. His name was practically corporate royalty. "What does Julian Vance have to do with this?" Clara asked, stepping toward him. "Everything," Marcus murmured, finally looking up at her. 6 years ago, I was Vance's protege. I idolized him. But I found out he was running an illegal offshore syndicate, laundering money through the firm's commercial accounts. I confronted him in Vegas. The exact same night I met you." Clara's breath hitched. The pieces were violently snapping into place. "The night we got married." "I was a dead man walking," Marcus confessed, his voice laced with a bitter, self-deprecating venom. "I had the evidence to destroy him. Vance offered me $70 million to hand over the hard drives and walk away. A quiet buyout. Clean, untraceable seed capital. I took the money, Clara. I took the payoff, and I let a criminal walk free because I wanted to build my own empire." He set the glass down with a sharp clink. "If the SEC decrypts my 2020 ledgers," Marcus said, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying certainty, "they won't find wire fraud. They will find the original, encrypted ledgers of Julian Vance's syndicate. They will find proof that the foundation of my entire empire was built on hush money. And, because I hold the assets, you become an accessory after the fact," Clara finished, the horror of the legal reality washing over her. "Marcus, that's federal racketeering. It's a 20-year mandatory minimum." "Chloe Dean doesn't just want to bankrupt the firm," Marcus whispered, closing the distance between them again. He reached out, his thumbs gently grazing her cheekbones, looking at her like she was the only clean thing left in his world. "She wants to put me in a federal penitentiary for the rest of my life. And she is going to succeed." "No," Clara said. The word was quiet, but it hit the air with the force of a gavel strike. Marcus blinked, stunned by the absolute steel in her voice. "Clara, the digital footprint is permanent. You can't litigate a ghost." "I don't need to litigate a ghost," Clara replied, her hands coming up to cover his where they held her face. The runaway wife was entirely gone. The apex predator he had forged had fully awakened. "I just need to prove that the seed capital wasn't a payoff." I need to prove it was a legitimate, legally binding transfer of marital assets. Marcus stared at her, his pulse skyrocketing. What are you talking about? Clara looked down at the cheap silver ring on her left hand. I am talking about the Vegas clause, Marcus, Clara said, her eyes flashing with pure, ruthless brilliance. You didn't take a payoff from Julian Vance. You took a loan. And I am going to draft the backdated paperwork to prove that the $70 million was a joint investment made by Mr. and Mrs. Croft. And that's the end of episode 25. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments below. Your feedback helps us know you're watching and encourages us to keep bringing you more content. See you in the next episode.